Portable TV. Come watch with me.
Despite a nationwide directive by President Trump to block evictions during the coronavirus pandemic, more and more Americans are being evicted over their inability to pay rent. So how is this happening, and will it only get worse as Congress continues to be unwilling to intervene? Joining me now to discuss is Boom Bust co-host Ben Swan. All right, Ben, how does this happen? I mean, Trump issued a directive to prevent evictions, so why are they still taking place across the country?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated here. If you go back into the summer, obviously in the spring and summer, Congress did intervene, right, and put a moratorium on any evictions that would take place across the country. But by the end of the summer, that moratorium had expired. The problem is Congress couldn't ever agree on another stimulus deal or coronavirus package, which would include another moratorium on those evictions. So it hasn't happened. As a result of that, what President Trump did was he issued a directive, as you said, in the fall to essentially say there shouldn't be evictions. The problem is that it's not law. It's just a directive. It was given by the president. It was kind of echoed, if you will, by the CDC. But the problem is in a lot of states like Missouri, there have been landlords who have gone to court and essentially said, we don't have to follow this directive. It's a directive, yes, but we disagree with it. And so in some states, it's not being applied. In some locations, people are still being evicted. And in many cases, quite honestly, Rachel, people just don't know that this directive even exists. So when they're getting evicted, they can't really go into court and say, hey, there's a presidential directive that stops this, because they don't even know it's out there in the first place to protect them.
Right, and millions of Americans still waiting for Congress to act or do anything when it comes to coronavirus relief. Okay, so who does and does not qualify under this presidential directive from Trump?
Yeah, so apparently to be eligible for this, a renter has to earn $198,000 or less if you're in a couple. It's $99,000 for a single filer. You also have to demonstrate that you have sought government help to pay your rent at some point. You can't just say, I don't have the money and leave it at that, because obviously the landlord has obligations they have to fulfill. And also you have to be able to show that because of COVID-19, you can't pay your rent. So there is some requirement here where a landlord can challenge you and say, hey, it's not an issue of COVID, this person just won't pay. And in fairness to the landlords, let's face it, all landlords are not a bunch of monsters sitting around just waiting to kick people onto the streets, but they many times don't own the properties that they are renting out. The bank actually owes them, and so they have to make payments on them. So it's really a messy situation because, you know, when you do put a moratorium in place, does that moratorium also protect the landlords who have to make payments back to the banks? And in the past, that has not been the case. So you need to be able to create a system where you say to the banks, you can't foreclose on a landlord who can't evict a tenant who is not having to pay. So the whole thing kind of echoes, if you will, from the top all the way down. But again, going back to the point of Congress, Congress is not getting involved, and they are not finding the time to actually do something about this situation.
Right, and when you're talking about evictions, you're talking about a lot of fear when it comes to the people who are being evicted, and then of course fear for those landlords who aren't able to pay the rent that they also owe. Let's look at these new numbers from the Eviction Lab, which show that during the pandemic, landlords in 26 cities have filed for more than 114,000 evictions. Now, almost 4,000 eviction notices were filed just last week. Is there any effort going on to stop this?
There isn't right now. I mean, there really isn't. Look, in total, if we want to talk about numbers, there's about 6 million Americans right now who are facing imminent eviction because they cannot make these payments. It's very important that people recognize that this is not a COVID issue. This is a response to COVID issue. So when a governor in a state says we're shutting down restaurants, bars, and places where people work, you know, service industry jobs dry up, when so many people don't have the ability to work right now, they don't have the ability to pay their rent. And so a lot of this comes back to the response to COVID that shuts this down. And that's why states need to be more hands-on and involved in this. If you are a governor of a state and you're telling people you can't work because we're worried about COVID numbers, then you need to also be involved in making sure that those individuals who can't work, not because they won't, not because they're lazy, not because they're unwilling, but because they are being ordered not to, also are being protected to not be kicked out onto the street. And remember, there's also a ripple effect that's caused here. Just because you reopen a state tomorrow doesn't mean that people are back to work tomorrow and getting those paychecks again. There's going to be a lag there for workers who, again, are kind of being left high and dry at this point.
Right, this certainly is a massive issue impacting millions of Americans, and it's crazy that we're not seeing more conversation on it. Ben Swan, thank you so much for your time.